Paula Pete works here. So I have been a very avid Kara supporter for a very long time on this channel. However, my allegiances must swing in a different direction because as of 1115, we see Carrot on Zoe. So she actually did go back to Zoe, which probably means that the Carrot agenda is dead. I'm so sorry, boys. I'm so sorry. I've been holding out for a very long time because we did not know where she was. But when proof comes, you have to accept it. And seeing her on Zoe most likely means that she is out of the narrative for now, and she will not join the main crew. That's a shame. Kind of sad about it. Had high expectations for her, but there is hope on the horizon for another character. That character being Stussy. Now, this is coming to mind after the events of chapter 1115 and the events of 1116, in which some very interesting character development type things do happen for Stussy that give you the feeling that she's a character in some ways like Robin was. And we're going to get to that in a little bit because there are a lot of weird parallels that she has with Robin that I didn't expect to find. But yeah, I'm very surprised by what I have seen. So let's get into it. So before we start theorizing, let's talk about what has happened recently in 1115 and 1116. So in 15, we see that Stussy has some trepidation about her existence now because all of what she has done, presumably her entire career as a character up to this point in the narrative, has been for Vegapunk Stella. And now that he is gone, she feels aimless in her existence. This then translates into the next chapter, 1116, in which Edison is talking to her and apologizes on behalf of Vegapunk, who he is technically. It's very weird, but he apologizes on the behalf of Vegapunk, stating that, "I'm sorry that you had to betray all those in CP0 who you see as friends, but because you found it in your heart to still work for us and do things on the behalf of Vegapunk himself and the Strawhats without significantly maiming your former co-workers, that shows you that you are indeed a human and you need to go on living. Do as you please." And then Stussy says, "Yes, sir." So from that, we can gather that this is very similar to other sort of Straw Hat mentor send-offs. What comes to mind and what's very, I guess, on point due to the topics of this video is when Tom gives Frankie his send-off in saying that, "Don't be ashamed of the things you make. Appreciate all that you have made with gusto." So it seems like this is a very similar situation. Or, to be even more on point, is very much like when Saul tells Robin to go off and find friends and keep on living. The situation is very similar too, because when Robin is escaping, the island of O'Hara is being Buster called for discovering information about the Void Century. Much like here in Egghead, Egghead Island is being Buster called for Vegapunk researching things about the Void Century. So the parallels cannot be ignored here, especially when Edison is an extension of Vegapunk. So it's much like Stussy's father, presumably, talking to her and telling her to go on, to keep living, to escape this situation. Much like how Saul, who acted like a sort of parental figure in a way to her at that time, who then tells her to go off, keep living, live your dreams, and discover the true history of this world. So these situations are very similar. And what kind of wrapped this entire thing up is that Saul, who was presumed dead, is found out to be alive in this very arc. the Egghead arc. So that even further strengthens the parallels here. But now that we've covered recent events, I think it's important to talk about Stussy's nature and how much like a Straw Hat she actually is. However, in order to do that, I think it's important to go over each and every Straw Hat and tell you why they're important and what they brought to the table upon entering the story. Because what people don't really talk about is that each time a Straw Hat has been introduced, except for one time, we have gotten something completely new and interesting in the story that wasn't there before. So, for example, with Luffy, he is our first Dough Fruit Eater in the story narratively. He introduces us to the rules of Dough Fruits and what happens once you eat one. Following that, we have characters like Zoro. Zoro, being the user of the three sword style, is unique because he is the only user of that style in the world. It's an inventive style that he himself made. On top of that, we are introduced to the world of swordsmen in a way, because upon him meeting Mihawk, we understand now that Zoro is striving to be the greatest swordsman in the world. But beforehand, we had no idea that there was a swordsman hierarchy of sorts. Following that, we have Nami. Nami has the ability to sense the weather, which is a very unique ability that only she has. And through her, we are constantly introduced to the importance of navigation and poses. Various types of poses throughout the entirety of the story. She is always there to be a holder or to introduce a type of navigation as the story calls for it. After her, we have Usopp. Usopp introduces us to the world of sharpshooting and gunslinging. He is the son of red-haired pirate Yasopp, who is also an experienced gunman. But through Usopp, we are introduced to a world of sharpshooting and how important sharpshooting can be. Following him, we have Sanji. Now, to be fair, Sanji's importance comes way later, but what's interesting about him is that he is a Germa mutant. He is the first of his kind in the story, because beforehand we weren't really privy to mutants existing, and he's even more important amongst his siblings because he has the ability to feel, and on top of that, he has the ability to repair himself. Whether those two things are intertwined with one another, we do not know, but I think it's something very important to find out, because after that, we get even more mutants in the story in the form of the Seraphim. Moving on from that, we have Chopper. Chopper is our gateway into true Zoan mechanics in the narrative, because it is through him that we find out that even though Zoans do have three forms, this rule is not set in stone and can be broken through the use of Chopper's Rumble Ball. He is also the first animal in the story to have eaten a Dough Fruit. He is regarded as a freak because of this, especially when you consider not many characters are animals that eat human fruits throughout the story. So far, there have only been two, and seeing as how the nature of Dough Fruits are usually one of a kind, he is the only animal that has eaten a normal human fruit. Following him, we have Robin. Robin is unique because due to her introduction as a main character, she alone raises the narrative ceiling of One Piece, because One Piece is no longer just a hunt for a treasure. It has become an archaeological expedition, because you need someone like Robin who can read the poneglyphs in order to find the treasure. This was an unknown aspect before she entered the story, and it's because of her we now find out the importance of history and poneglyphs, which becomes an even bigger deal even when things aren't necessarily related to the treasure itself as we move forward. Following her, we have Frankie. Frankie's another really big character because he heightens the technological ceiling of One Piece as a whole. Before him, we had no idea that there were such things as cyborgs present within the story. We have had people like Crocodile or Zeph, who simply replace their limbs with other attachments, but never before have we seen a fully cybernetic man. And from his introduction, the technology of One Piece keeps going higher and higher and higher, but he is actually the official start. Following him, we have Brook. Brook is a very interesting case because I don't think a lot of people think about this, but Brook's existence heightens the devil fruit ceiling exponentially, because before him, devil fruit powers were weird, but they weren't as esoteric as his is, because what his does is that it allows him to cheat death, come back, and then have a ton of other abilities after the time skip, which go into even more very strange metaphysical aspects, like the ability to control soul, because his soul beats on a different wavelength than everyone else's, and he can create cryokinesis and all these other types of things. And I would say him being the poster boy for the entirety of Thriller Bark, because it's actually Thriller Bark that really starts to do this, because Moria is in the same situation as he removes a concept from a person, turns it into a matter, and then without this concept being attached to a person, if they are caught in sunlight, the world erases them. This is the first time in which a devil fruit power is connected to existence erasure in the narrative, which I find very important and very fascinating, because before this, there were no abilities that were bound to the realities of the One Piece world. Though Brook and Moria are the poster boys for that, which is why I say Brook is very important. And then Piranha is more or less the same thing, because never before have we had a devil fruit that affects a person's mental and emotional state. That is also a unique and important thing. On top of that, there hadn't been a devil fruit before that summoned familiars that could be connected to the user. That too is another important aspect. So I say Brook, and by extension Thriller Bark, completely and totally raise the devil fruit ceiling and what devil fruits are actually able to do. This sort of weird, nearly reality warping bits of abilities that now exist in the world. It's even stranger because Brook is the only person in his position, most likely, who literally is a skeleton. And yet, despite being a skeleton, he can exist as a normal human. That too is why Brook is important and why Brook is unique. The only character so far that has not done any of these things for One Piece as a whole is Jinbei. There will be another video about Jinbei specifically, but as far as I know, Jinbei doesn't have these sort of world heightening or in-depth lore aspects that the others have. The most I can say about Jinbei is that through his existence, we do have a formal explanation of how Fishman Karate works. So, what does all this have to do with Stussy? Well, Stussy has a lot of firsts in the narrative, and she also covers something that we have not really gone over that much so far, but has existed in a number of arcs since Alabasta. So she is the first human clone in history. She is a clone of former Rocks Pirate and former Mads member Buckingham Stussy. So, in being the first clone in history, she supersedes all other clone experiments after her. She's more important than the Germa clones. She's more important than the satellites. She's more important than the Seraphim, because she is the first clone in history. This is important, and this makes her a unique creature like many people on the Straw Hat crew. Another thing, it is highly implied that she is the first artificial devil fruit user in history, because in chapter 1172. The reason why this chapter is important is because we find out a lot about Stussy in this chapter. The nature of what she is revealed once the chapter begins, and at the end, her powers are revealed when she knocks out Kaku and Lucy. Now, this is important because this is also the same chapter in which we have the Mads cover story. In said entry of the Mads cover story, we see Caesar Clown, Queen, and Vince Smoke Judge all younger as members of Mads. And we see their three specialties. Judge and his weird spear, which really doesn't have much to do with him going forward, but whatever, he does use a spear in the future. We see Queen and his chemicals, probably him starting his fascination with diseases and plagues. And then we have Caesar Clown holding a devil fruit. Said devil fruit is a unique devil fruit, as I've said in videos before, because this devil fruit has the O's of an artificial devil fruit, but it has the curly stem of a normal devil fruit, which means that based on what we see in the chapter, it is very likely that Stussy is the holder now of this unique artificial devil fruit, because Occam's razor would suggest if all of this is happening in the same chapter, this devil fruit was put here for a reason. We start the chapter off with the devil fruit being revealed, and then we end the chapter with the devil fruit in use, presumably. This still has not been confirmed, but just simply connecting the dots is the conclusion I have come to. She is the user of this fruit. I did a entire video on it, but I presume that this fruit is an artificial devil fruit that contains the power of a vampire bat, not the mythical creature, but a normal vampire bat. And this is revealed even a little bit more so in the anime adaptation of this chapter. But for more information on that, please go watch my video on the fruit that I made. There'll be a link to that in this video. However, moving on, the thing that I think is what's going to make Stussy important and heighten the ceiling of One Piece yet again in terms of narrative is her connection to the underworld. You see, the underworld is a huge crime network that we have been fed piecemeal throughout the story, as early as Alabasta, because dance powder is a black market item sold in the underworld. However, we have also had a member on the crew who is associated with the underworld in Frankie, but based on what we see from him, he was simply a man who knew how to access the market, not someone who has been a part of any significant portion of the underworld as a whole. Stussy, however, is an emperor of the pleasure corner, whatever that entails of. So with her being a member of the Strawhat crew, this could then open the door to the importance of the underworld as a aspect in the narrative, because we've seen it so many times without any real formal explanation about how it works or who's in it. I have to give some credit, however, to Discord member and big One Piece community member in general, Mr. Bushido, because Mr. Bushido, though I have to apologize to him because I am jumping ship from the carrot train. He's been a big carrot supporter, but he did make something very apparent to me, that the underworld seems to have some sort of CP0 like tendencies, because during the demonstration of Smiley and Shinokuni, we see a very odd man with a bird headdress on his head. It's like this big black bird like headdress, and that says to me that potentially, as Mr. Bushido said too, that there could be some strange hierarchy or organization within the underworld like there is in CP0, because as you know, in CP0, the high-ranking members wear masks. This is also a possible callback, again, much like I think how the CP0 thing developed, to the masks present in Water 7. But I say all this to say that I think Stussy is going to be our door into the inner workings of the underworld, or more underworld activities, seeing as how she was a big wig in the underworld and not just a common buyer like most of the characters that we have seen have been. Like Doflamingo was just a product supplier, the Crocodile was a buyer, Frankie was a buyer, etc., etc. But she, being intimate with the inner workings of it, will most likely be our gateway into it. And that is why I think she is important, because she offers something that not many characters so far have. Moving forward, however, we should start talking about the weird similarities between Stussy and Robin in the narrative, because much like how Robin makes a surprise cameo appearance in Frankie's flashback through Tom slamming down her wanted poster on the desk, we see Stussy appear in the joint flashback of Kuma and Bonnie. This is very interesting too, because what Stussy says in the flashback really does relate back to what's going on in the present. Even after all this time has passed from the flashback into present day, she still has some very unresolved feelings about her existence as someone else's clone, as she compares her own humanity to Kuma eventually losing his, saying how it's a travesty, you're going to lose something that I never really had, which is kind of nuts. And I think is what is going to be her character arc moving forward if she does become a main character. Another interesting thing to point out is that when Frankie has his flashback and when we see Robin in his flashback, it's very interesting that during the Ennis Lobby arc, the two of them are paired up quite often. And much like the arc we're having now, it is an arc in which we're dealing with the government, depths of the government, actually, because CP9 is a secret organization within the world government. We're dealing with CP9 and we're dealing with Rob, Lucy, and Kaku. Much like in Egghead, we're dealing with an even deeper organization within the world government, in which we're dealing with Cypher, Poe, Aegis Zero. And then we have, again, Kaku and Lucy, who act as not main antagonists, but smaller antagonists in this arc. So going off of that and looking at Ennis Lobby, I think it's very likely, seeing as how we have Frankie join and Robin rejoin at the same time, I think it's quite likely, like back then, we're going to have two people join at the same time. Most likely Bonnie and Stussy. Perhaps even Bonnie will put in a good word for Stussy, seeing as how she knows about Stussy based on viewing Kuma's memories via the bubble he left behind. What would be also very interesting is that Stussy acts as a stowaway during the escape on the Thousand Sunny, much like how Robin was introduced when the crew was leaving Alabasta. Very, very high possibility, especially when you consider that Alabasta is starting to play a role, even though it's a very small role, in the Egghead arc. Because, of course, we have the topic of Pluton and the ancient weapons coming up, and the directions of where to find Pluton were located in Alabasta. So it's a very, very interesting web of connections that start to come up. But continuing with the comparisons between Robin and Stussy, it's very interesting that the antagonists of Ennis Lobby are regarded as friends to Stussy, now an Egghead, which is just a small tidbit, but another really bigger part of their connection is that Stussy's father, Vegapunk, was helped immensely by basically all the father figures in Robin's life. Both Clover and Saul aided in various ways to Vegapunk finding out about the nature of the world, because Clover was the guy who went around the world and built this great library in O'Hara. When O'Hara burned down, it was Saul who saved and rescued all the books to be put in a library in Elbaf, which is where Vegapunk started to research. So it's quite funny how the fathers of these two women are so intertwined together. Going off of that, just talking about powers, it's also very interesting that Robin's flower fruit And her ultimate technique so far is in the form of a succubus or a big demon-like woman, right? Whereas with Stussy, when she reveals herself to be a Delphi user, she grows bat wings and looks like a succubus, much like how Robin looks in her Black Maria fight. And I just wanted to point that out because that's a very interesting concept. Another thing they have in common is that the two are both assassins in a way. Robin's specialty was assassination, which is how she introduced herself to Usopp. And then, of course, Stussy, her ability is assassination as well. And she actually exercises this as she does seemingly off Lufeld during the Tea Party, which makes a lot of sense because the six powers were always a tool for assassination. Now, you consider her role in the crew and what her position may be. I think I have an idea, and this is basically ripping out some of the notes that I have had and some people in the community have had on Carrot joining and applying it to Stussy because I think it fits rather well. You see, when talking about Stussy and Bonnie, I think some important aspects of their character and how they exist in One Piece is based off of gags shown in the SBS. For Bonnie, for example, there's been a gag in the SBS for a few years now about how characters will look in good or bad timelines once they get older. Bonnie's whole ability is just that gag. So if she does indeed join the crew, Oda can use that gag freely because now that's a canonical ability. On that topic too, you remember how we talked about how Brook raised the Del Fruit ceiling? Bonnie is that as well, because never before have we had a Del Fruit that can pull out possibilities in a timeline and bring them to the forefront. Just in concept, that's crazy. But I digress. I did do a separate video on what position I think Bonnie would play if she joined the crew. There should be a link right now about that. Where Stussy comes into this is that all the Straw Hats in SBSs have revealed to have times in which they go to sleep. Stussy, based on my analysis, is most likely a vampire bat zoan, which means she's a nocturnal creature, which means she would stay up during most of the night. Therefore, I think instead of Carrot being a lookout, Stussy might indeed be our lookout because she can fly, and thanks to the anime, we know that she has infrared vision, which is a bit more ideal than anyone else that we've seen with sight powers in the story. Another very helpful bat ability in conjunction with infrared vision that Stussy may have is that vampire bats in the real world can use echolocation, in which they emit a high frequency sound. That high frequency sound bounces off an object, and that sound then returns to the bat. So in this situation, Stussy could perhaps let out a high frequency sound. It bounces off an enemy ship several kilometers away. The sound comes back to her, and then she knows what's exactly in the area. What also could lend to her being a lookout is that she, much like Lucy and Kaku have done in the past, is hiding in plain sight. So she has been a spy. And we don't know what the Pleasure District entails of, because she was the queen of the Pleasure District at the time, which is her sort of realm of the underworld. But I would assume that it has something to do with info brokering, because I would think many high class clients come to her for particular activities, and people who she is in charge of probably tell her things that they have told them, and she uses that information as leverage against them. So you can kind of say that this goes back to being a lookout, because a lookout's main job is info gathering, and she would be doing just that, gathering info on clients. But moving on. Honestly, what better ability for a lookout to have than to see incoming threats through their vessels via their heat signature? That's better than anything else. And what is even more interesting about this is that she probably does have experience in scoping out threats or scoping out individuals if she was the vampire bat that gives all the warlords their invitations. We don't know if that's a confirmed thing yet, but I talk about it in my video about her being a vampire bat. So that's why I really think she is an ideal candidate to be a lookout, because she has a tool, thanks to the anime, that we know would be effective in scoping out threats. And I'm willing to bet, based on that being shown in the anime, it's going to be canon in the manga. And again, I go over this in my Stussy video about her being a vampire bat Zoan. Moving forward, however, taking the time to go over some more miscellaneous information before we go over what I think her dream is going to be. I think her color is going to be white. Now, I know Brooke is the only Straw Hat currently with 2 colors, and I've always said if he was going to lose one color to another character, it will most likely be white, seeing as how black represents him better, as his afro is such a significant part of his design and such a significant part of his character, seeing as how it's the only thing from his body that he has left. It's most likely that he'll be only represented by black. And you see this in a lot of promotional material. He's usually depicted in some sort of grayish purple or just straight up gray. He's never really represented by white. It's always something closer to black. So that's why I think his main color will be black, and Stussy's will be white, because she's been represented by white through the entirety of the franchise so far. When she is undercover as an emperor of the underworld, she has a white hat. In CP0, she's wearing white, and her egghead design has white in it. So most likely her color will be white. Now, in terms of family position, I think these are going to get changed around again. And I think Frankie is going to lose his position currently as the grandmother, which is just weird to begin with. And that will most likely go to Stussy, because Stussy most likely would be the oldest female in the crew at that point, because I'm willing to bet, based on the timeline, she's most likely older than Robin, probably in her 40s. So I think that would make sense for her, which I think would be a very unique moment if Bonnie joins alongside her, because it would be much like how after Enies Lobby you have Robin rejoining and Frankie joining, and those two were both the oldest female and the oldest male member at that time. They represented the mother and father dynamic. Whereas with Stussy and Bonnie, you would have the youngest female character join the crew and the oldest female character join the crew. So in that way, they kind of make for a very interesting pair, like how Robin and Frankie did back in the day. So in thinking about Stussy and what her dream might be, I think her dream might be to see the truth of the world, to see the final result of what Vegapunk was researching. And in order to see that, it would make sense that she would be on a ship with a crew going after the One Piece, because the One Piece is the key to the truth of the world. Seeing as how Roger and the gang learned everything once they got to Laugh Tale and found the One Piece. So that's what I think her dream would be. And based on her struggles with the matters of her existence, this could also play a role in fulfilling her purpose as a person, because even though Vegapunk didn't see the outcome of the world, she saw it for him. So I guess you could say in that situation, she is the main holder of his will in that way. It would also be nice for her to come to terms with her being a person in her own right, just based on traveling around with the crew and having a found family who cares and appreciates her. And seeing as how there are so many freaks on the crew already, she might feel right at home, because even though you have people on the crew like Brooke who have lost everything of their humanity, they still have the will to move forward and press on. So if he can, she can. But I almost forgot. Some people may consider Stussy's reputation a problem and a barrier to her joining the crew. The fact of the matter is that even though she is an emperor of the underworld, and even though she is a high-ranking member in CP0, or at least a former high-ranking member in CP0, the fact of the matter is that she was never a pirate. She stays in her own niche. She stays in her own lane. She's not stepping on the toes of anybody else coming into the crew. This is usually the case with the majority of the members in the crew. Even those who were pirates have a considerably lower bounty or a lower reputation in comparison to the majority of the crew. This is true for Brooke, and this would be true for Bonnie if she joins, because her current bounty is very similar to, say, Nami's bounty. Even 300 million at this point doesn't really matter. The only exception to this that we have seen in the story so far is Jinbei, because in terms of reputation as a pirate, Jinbei is only second to Luffy. This is his third Yonko crew. He's been a pirate captain. He's been a warlord. Warlords, of course, are important. That's why there are several clones of them running around now. They are big figures on the world stage, and several characters in the story have reacted to Jinbei's presence. So being a warlord is a big deal. But with that being said, Stussy doesn't have that reputation as a pirate, making her much like, say, Robin, because even though Robin had a bounty before she joined, Robin had never been a part of a pirate organization before. Baroque Works, for example, is not a pirate organization. It was a mercenary organization ran by a pirate. So even though she was the highest ranking female member within that organization, she was never a pirate herself before joining the Strawhat crew. And the reason why she had a bounty in the first place as a child was a information control attempt by the world government to snuff out the last person in the world who can read the poneglyphs. So her bounty was a lie. And with that being said, that's all I have for you today. Give me your thoughts. We talked a lot about Stussy today, but I really do like her as a character.